I've been asked to chair this particular session. Just in terms of the agenda, Mike Surridge was not able to make it, so we have we have an immense 4 speakers here who are going to talk about the issues of security obligations and internet intermediaries. First up we have Neil Brown, who it says, I got sent the message that said he's a lawyer. The end. No, a lawyer and a PhD researcher, and the title of his presentation is The Framework for Provider Security in 10 Minutes and Counting. Thank you.
So the last time I did my undergraduate degree here as well as my master's and now my PhD, and the last time I was in this room I was learning to ride a unicycle up and down the front here. But having been told to talk about network and service security obligations for 10 minutes, the unicycle seemed a lot more entertaining as options go. As Ian said, my name's Neil. I've been a lawyer for Vodafone for the last 10 years. I was head of privacy for the last 4 or so. Now I spend most of my time looking after network and service security and law enforcement assistance. I'm a director of the UK Telecommunications Academy, where I teach around the world on telecoms, law and regulation, and seemingly in my spare time I'm trying to write my PhD here as well on regulation of over-the-top communications services. I've been given 10 minutes to talk about the basic framework for network and service security in Europe. 10 minutes will probably seem the longest time you could possibly want to listen to this for, but let's see what we can do for that. I have no slides. I thought you might have a long time, have a lot of slides today, but can I borrow a couple of you? Can I borrow you? You don't have to do it very much at all. Would you mind? No? Alexandra, wonderful. If I can put you here, that would be perfect. And may I borrow one from this side over as well? Someone's sitting on the end. And if I can have you just here as well, this is going to ruin the video recording, I'm so sorry. Standing there. Now, we need to talk about network and service security, a network. So if I can get you to hold that.
I wasn't lying. I wasn't lying.
Well, no slides but 15-foot of Ethernet cable. Yes. And put that over there as well.
Safety.
If you can hold that. Beautifully done. We now have a communications network. And we start when we look at network and service provider security with the physical network. And we start in the Framework Directive, 2002-21 EC, Article 13A, and we start talking about physical security of networks. So we can give you that as well. We talk about the physical protection of the networks. Service network providers must ensure that their networks have adequate physical protection against attacks. And when we look at Article 13A of the Framework Directive, we're fundamentally talking about cyber security and cyber resiliency. So as well as the physical protection of networks, we have the more logical protection, black and white printer, but that is a firewall printed out. So we've got both the physical side of network security, and we've got the more IP side of the network security. You move on slightly, we talk about nature of cyber resiliency, the fact, can someone come in and cut the wire and talk about it? Article 13A(2) of the directive. So this is one provider's network connecting A with B. What happens when you actually want to talk to someone on a different network? Well, it's technically a little more complicated, but let's assume we now have a point of interconnection attached to our network. So you can now not just call someone on the same network, you can speak to providers on other networks as well. The point here, the point of interconnection, is a particular focus of the European security obligations under the Framework Directive. It calls it out specifically and says that providers must take appropriate measures to secure the point of interconnection. And if you're a provider in the UK trying to build a network with a point of interconnect, you will have come across a particular standard, and that's ND 1643. If you meet that standard, Ofcom has said you satisfy your obligations for interconnect service security. So we start there. The first obligation, network and server security, physical and logical, and particularly at the point of interconnection. If I can keep you there just for a few moments longer, we move then from the network to the idea of messages being conveyed along this network. It's low tech, but it might just work. So we move from the framework directive, talking about network security, to obligations of security coming from the message itself. And we then dive second into the data protection directive. And if you look at recital 47 to the directive, it talks about two things. It talks about data that a communications provider generates or adds to a message for the purpose of conveying it along this communications network. And we can think of those as sort of the address on the outside of the envelope. The provider is the controller in respect of the data that it puts on there for the purposes of transmitting it across its service. And as a controller, Principle 7 requires it to take appropriate technical and organisational security measures. So that's Principle 2 for security of service providers in Europe. But of course, the messages that it carries in its network may too contain personal data. A sends a message to B, that may contain personal data. Now, recital 47 makes very clear that the controller in respect of personal data contained within a message is the person who sends the message. But it's perfectly possible that the provider is a processor for the carriage of those data, and to the extent that it's required by the Data Protection Directive, there is likely to be a contract between the data controller and the data processor, obliging the processor to meet the security requirements imposed on the controller. So that's Principle 3, a contractual obligation arising under the data protection framework for the content of the message, and 2, controllership relating to the data for carrying the message in itself. But on top of that, the E-Privacy Directive, 2002/58/EC, imposes an obligation on providers for the overall processing of personal data in the provision of their service, their network. So, irrespective of what may exist under data protection law, Principle 4 are obligations that arise under the e-privacy framework. You following me so far?
Yeah.
And this is broadly the world that I live in, to try and advise a communications network on where the different bases of security come from. Those are 4 so far. Add on top of that we've already talked about in broad terms, critical national infrastructure. Orders may be placed on providers to ensure that their networks are protected. They're resilient, both to disruption, to attack, and in terms of the security provided. Principle 5 then, obligations that arise under domestic frameworks for critical national infrastructure. Principle 6, laying on top of all this sector-specific stuff, principles of general law. If I provide to you as a consumer an electronic communications service, and it doesn't have appropriate security, am I providing the service with reasonable skill and care? If I haven't, have I breached and implied a term that will be automatically implied into a consumer contract? It's possible. Is there a duty of care on the provider to ensure that their network is appropriately secure? If I breach that duty, am I negligent? Potentially so. The last thoughts I want to leave you with before people holding cables' arms fall off would be to say that the General Data Protection Regulation, if it passes in its current form, may well impose further obligations. At the moment, obligations under data protection law apply to the controllers with the requirement for a contractual framework to a processor. But if the GDPR imposes positive obligations on processors as well, that sounds like yet another layer, layer 7, of regulation on communication service providers. You may also have heard of the Network and Information Security Directive that's going through at the moment as well. I'm not quite clear which providers will be caught under that. I think it talks in terms of market actors, and it's designed to deal with search engine providers and social networks, but probably not over-the-top communication services. And if thinking back to the IP introduction, we're not quite clear what necessarily is a service provider, what's an information society service, and what's an electronic communication service. Once you get into the world of over-the-top services as well, and potentially market actors under the NIS directive, that will be level 8, yet another layer of complexity to add to it. I think that's still well within the 10 minutes. Hopefully that's an introduction to the area to you. Thank you very much. The two people have been very kind.